Welcome back, geographers. We are back with another video. So it's another case study style video where I'm going to be going through superpowers. I'm going to be covering all the latest news stories that relate to key ideas 7.1 right through to 7.9. Let's get going. Hold it right there though. Before we dive into globalization, let's talk about May the 21st. Now, we're just coming off the back of what was a dream of a paper one paper. Absolute dream. But if you're now feeling that paper two pressure, maybe it's your Achilles heel, I am running another massive 2-day masterclass this weekend to get you as exam ready as possible for that paper 2 next Thursday. In those 2 days, we're going to be smashing through the entire core content for that paper 2 paper. We'll be covering globalization and we'll be covering superpowers. That'll be on the Saturday. On the Sunday, that's when we break it down into our optional modules. First thing, you'll either go into the regen room or the diverse room. In the afternoon, it's either HHRI or it's migration. Whichever your optional modules, we've got you covered. No one gets left behind. $24.99 for the weekend, $34.99 for the 5-day intensive. Get yourself booked on now. So let's start with key idea 7.1. What makes a superpower? In your exam, you need to prove that power isn't just about one use of one solitary pillar. It's about that multifaceted approach using all the pillars in the right ways in certain place contexts. We're talking the military, we're talking the economic, we're talking the cultural, we're talking the political, and we're talking the resource. Now in 2026, all eyes are on the use of hard power. It's being brought back into fashion, and no story epitomizes that better than the 3rd of January invasion of Venezuela in 2026 by the US. The US Special Forces captured President Maduro. This is hard power in its purest form, using a combination of military force and economic sanctions to achieve a geopolitical aim and directly change a foreign regime. Because think about it, in a nation like Venezuela, where they were dead set on having a socialist, nationalist regime, they are going to be very, very resistant to any soft power influence from the West. They're just going to block it completely. So the only way to achieve a geopolitical aim there is hard power, direct force, coercion, the use of a direct power mechanism. So that's combining the use of the military pillar and the economic pillar as well, because without that economic pillar, you can't have a strong military to carry out those geopolitical objectives. And as such, what's probably going to happen now is there's going to be a regime change to a more democratic government that favors capitalism as an economic model. TNCs can now enter the country and they can take advantage of the vast oil wealth that Venezuela has. So there we go, hard power back in fashion. But let's not take our eye off soft power as well. This is also one of those long-term, ticking away in the background style strategies. So what soft power moves are nations playing in 2026? Well, it's the ability to get what you want through persuasion or attraction rather than force. So a brilliant 2025 case study is the HEPI Index. And this shows that both the US and the UK still rule the world in terms of education systems, in particular educating world leaders. Currently, 66 world leaders were educated in US universities and 59 in UK universities. So when a future president or prime minister studies at places like Harvard or Oxford, then they carry those Western values and ideals home with them, and they're more likely to instill them in their national policies. Now let's look at smart power and what's going on with different nations in terms of smart power. Smart power is using a combination approach. It's that perfect mix, using what a nation has in terms of resources, in terms of political persuasion, in terms of any cultural exports, and using them to achieve their geopolitical aims in the best way possible for them. Saudi Arabia is mastering this right now with their Vision 2030. By investing $1 billion into global sports like football, boxing in particular, they're using their huge oil wealth, their economic pillar essentially, or that combination of the economic and the resource pillar, to rebrand their global image. It's a soft power move. It's using all the pillars to rebrand themselves. So it's using a bit of hard power, a bit of economic power, smart power essentially, and rebranding, having that soft power projection throughout the world. And finally, another one to keep watching out for is sharp power. We've already seen many examples of sharp power playing out, particularly in democracies. This is a method favoured by authoritarian dictatorships, and it's one that's used to destabilise democracies. A key feature in democracies is the elections that take place, and what authoritarian dictatorships have realised is that one of the best ways to kind of create a system of instability within these democracies is to try and sabotage their elections. Quite a simple process. Create some AI bots, install them in the Western social media platform, and create echo chambers for both sides on the political debate. Rile them up into a frenzy, and then before you know it, you've got riot. And this is a sharp form of power because it's a targeted attempt to pierce and manipulate the information space of a country to maintain control. And if we look to Iran as well, there's many countries now using kind of a sharp power defense, if you like. So Iran frequently cited as shutting down social media channels, shutting down use of the internet. Use of Starlink even is now punishable by death, as it's seen as a form of espionage. So in your mocks, if you get any kind of assess question or explain question on what might be the most important way of gaining geopolitical influence, or what pillar might be most important, or what form of power might be most important, you've got a number of examples there of where different countries have chosen to prioritize different forms of power to achieve different geopolitical aims in different geopolitical contexts across different timescales, and that's the debate that you've now got to have. So that's 7.1, quite a big overview because there's so much of that becomes foundational and a golden thread throughout Superpowers. Then we move on to key idea 7.2. Now think about the content from 7.2. It's a bit of a history lesson. So we start with the British Empire, we then go to World War II, we then move to the Cold War, and then we move to the unipolar world that we currently have now, or what seems like that transition from a unipolar to either a bipolar or a multipolar world. We are in a transition period though. What we look at in 7.2 is when there are different patterns of power like unipolar, bipolar, multipolar, what are the advantages and disadvantages? And what are the mechanisms to gain geopolitical influence in each of these time periods? Now, one of the things that we talk about when we look at the British Empire is this idea of colonial control. Colonial control, very, very simple. It's invade, you're ours now. As we transitioned then into the Cold War, after the collapse of empires in the immediate aftermath of World War II, there was more indirect forms of control that then took place, and we call this a kind of neo-colonial control. And this has been a key feature of geopolitics since the end of World War II, particularly throughout the Cold War. And it's a way of nations having no direct responsibility for what goes on within a particular nation, but almost being like the puppet master that controls them using different neo-colonial methods. So in 2026, superpowers now don't need to rule by military force or by bullets. They can govern by both budget and increasingly so by data. The new frontier, 2026 and beyond, is this form of digital neo-colonialism. And no example is better in 2025 and 2026 than China's digital Silk Road. They've invested over 22 billion in digital infrastructure across the global south, where they are trying to gain more allies. Chinese TNCs like Huawei, they don't just build roads, they build the nervous systems of nations, providing the AI-enabled surveillance and cloud servers that local governments now depend on to try and maintain some form of order or control within their countries. And there's all sorts of mechanisms that we can then talk about. This is obviously a form of lending, so we can talk about the idea of the debt trap that these countries are now facing. And this extends to any kind of infrastructure. So let's say Djibouti, for example. They borrowed heavily for a strategic port and railway, and they now owe more than 80% of their entire GDP to China. So when a small nation can't pay back these multi-billion-dollar loans, the superpower gains massive leverage, and they will then attempt to influence their foreign policy or gain some kind of military foothold within that country. This happened in Sri Lanka, for example, where they now have a 99-year lease on one of their military bases. So it remains to be seen. There's been a lot of lending going on by China, and we'll look at that later in the video, but is this now becoming less of a development opportunity and more of an opportunity for China to engage in some kind of neo-colonial mechanisms of control? Key idea 7.3, numerous things that we talk about in 7.3. One of the most important things you can be revising are the different development theories. So you've got modernization theory, you've got dependency theory, and you've got world systems theory. Now, modernization theory and world systems theory are an excellent set of examples of theoretical models that can explain the growth of emerging powers. And what we look at in 7.3 is the ability of those emerging powers to potentially challenge the hegemonic status of the US. Now, what your textbooks will probably include is an overview of BRICS, but I'm going to argue that that is now an out-of-date case study for you. As of January 2026, under India's presidency, we are now in the era of BRICS Plus. The bloc has nearly doubled in size. So remember, this formal association goes back to 2009, and it was a way of challenging US influence in the global financial financial system. But the bloc has now nearly doubled in size. It includes major energy giants like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, alongside emerging giants like Indonesia, which have huge and youthful populations. So why does this matter for your mocks? Because this expanded group now represents over half the world's population and generates around 36% of the global GDP. And what used to be just kind of a little bit of a forum, if you like, with the combined efforts of groups of nations which essentially had a little bit more money than they used to, is now becoming an energy and financial powerhouse. So for example, BRICS Plus now controls over 40% of global oil output, an essential component of any nation's resource pillar, particularly in a global economic system that is so dependent on oil. But the real power move for 2026 is the push for financial sovereignty. What do we mean by that? The group is actively moving away from the US dollar, with their new development bank, the bank that was designed to counter the dominance of the IMF and the World Bank, aiming to provide 30% of its loans in local currencies by the end of this year, meaning that the US dollar is increasingly becoming less of a dominant currency in global financial systems, particularly within financial systems that focus on loans to developing countries and emerging countries. But, and there's always a but, there's a major weakness. And you'll do this if you do migration, identity and sovereignty. There is internal fragmentation. In your exam, you've got to evaluate making reference to the tensions within the BRICS group. So you might have heard a few of the nations that I mentioned there. So we've got Saudi Arabia. Also part of the group is Iran, and what we'll do in Key Idea 7.8 is look at the internal rivalry in the Middle East between Saudi Arabia and Iran. They have been long-standing geopolitical rivals. So with a group like BRICS Plus, can they see past those past rivalries and come together as a collective force that is sufficient enough to counter US dominance and the dominance of the Western allies? So this diversity is strength for global representation, but it makes reaching consensus very difficult, and consensus on hard political issues probably nearly impossible. So is it going to be a group that rivals Western dominated systems? It remains to be seen. You can best put that down as a future uncertainty. So while their combined growth forecast is set to be triple that of the G7 by the end of 2026, their internal rivalries could significantly weaken that political pillar of power. Now for Key Idea 7.4, this idea of global economic influence and the degree to which superpowers still have that influence over global economic system. For decades, the world has run on a unipolar financial system, dominated by the US dollar and the SWIFT financial transaction system. But in 2026, we are witnessing the genuine birth of a bipolar financial system. The big player here in 2026 is the growth of the CIPS, or otherwise known as China's cross-border interbank payment system. While the West uses SWIFT, China is increasingly using CIPS, CHIPS, as a parallel financial highway that allows countries to trade directly in yuan, completely bypassing US oversight and sanctions, and that's the important point. And the data for 2026 is quite staggering. As of January, CIPS has grown to over 1,700 participants across 180 countries. So this is no longer just a technical curiosity. It's now the backbone of trade for the expanded BRICS bloc. So this makes an excellent case study for challenging the degree to which the US still holds that dominance over global financial systems. Because remember, we can talk about technology, we can talk about patents, we can talk about westernization. But if we think about this economic power play move by China to create this cross-border payment system, there's a new financial world, a new global financial system developing country by country. It's starting regional, but who knows, that could spread to the entirety of the global south, which would really challenge the financial dominance of the global north, which classically has been led by the US. But as ever in superpowers, it remains to be seen. So why does this matter for your mocks? Well, like I've said, it's that economic power play move, and China is using recently communicated $1.2 trillion trade surplus to force the internationalization of its currency. So by 2026, it's looking like 1 out of every 12 global transactions will take place using yuan. A record high that challenges the US dollar's long-standing hegemony. And this ties in beautifully with what we were just talking about before, with the whole neo-colonial move for digital infrastructure creation by China between all of its BRI nations. Now for Key Idea 7.5, 5, this is all about international decision making and the degree to which superpowers get themselves involved in international crises and crises response. So what we're going to look at is the increasing degree to which emerging nations are now influential figures in global action. And this is from crisis response to conflict. So in 2026, we're seeing two very different models of peacekeeping. First, let's look at the US, which is kind of a hard peace model. Once again, here we can reference the US invasion of Venezuela. Internal conflict within Venezuela is solved by a hard power move from the US. Remove the president by force and then begin that transition to a democratic leader. And what you will have recently seen in the news here as a gesture or a symbol of gratitude from the opposition leader, you will see that the opposition leader, Maria Machado, presented Donald Trump with her 2025 Nobel Peace Prize. Now, it's not officially transferred. This is just a gesture, a sense of gratitude. She described it as recognition for his principled and decisive action. And that display is presenting the US still as a dominant force in international conflict. It's bringing the US back as this global police force. We're seeing that Trump's model of peacekeeping is exactly that. It's hard power, coercive force. The ordering of the capture of a foreign leader to secure a democratic transition. And it's also a return to this idea of unilateralism. This was absolutely not what the UN would want. However, it's this classic superpower, do now, apologize, clean up the mess later. Now contrast this with China's role. China is going much more down the route of being an intermediary. While the US uses force, China is positioning itself as being the world's most significant diplomatic mediator. So in late 2025 and early 2026, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi reaffirmed China's role in maintaining the historic peace agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, emphasizing a policy of amity, sincerity, and non-interference. China's strategy here is very much a form of soft power. They present themselves as the neutral alternative to the US or to Western forms of interventionism, focusing on sovereignty and state-to-state cooperation, meaning that by late 2025 and early 2026, many global South nations began to see China as a more stable partner for conflict resolution because they don't demand that political conditionality, i.e. they don't tell you how to run your country. If anything, they just help you to trade. So in your mocks, this is a really useful idea to contrast, and it allows you to keep bringing in this idea of different use of different pillars and different forms of power being influential in different contexts. So mentioning Trump's Nobel medal gift and Wang Yi's tour or 2026 tour of Africa will show that you have the most up-to-date knowledge. Now moving on to key idea 7.6. Now this key idea focuses on superpowers' disproportionate impact on the physical environment. Now for decades what we've focused on mainly is a disproportionate superpower usage of fossil fuels. And it's not to say that that's not still relevant. Of course it's still relevant. But increasingly what we're seeing is that positioning of different nations to be the climate leader. China in particular with its increasing investment into green technologies. But in 2026 there's now a new environmental conflict, and it's the AI superpower race. Superpowers like the US and China are locked in a competition to build the world's largest AI superclusters, and it's reshaping the planet's energy map. The numbers here are quite concerning. Global electricity demand from data centers in particular is on track to double between now and 2030, reaching nearly 1,000 terawatt hours, roughly the entire annual energy consumption of Japan. So in the US alone, data centers could jump from using just 4% of a nation's electricity to 12%. So why would we consider this an environmental disaster? Because AI requires accelerated servers that draw in 30% more energy usage every single year compared to the more conventional servers. So training a single large AI model can use the total volume of energy that would be enough to supply 200 US homes for a year. And to keep these systems running, superpowers are having to increase increase the combustion of fossil fuels. So in the US, for example, the Trump administration has used this and the requirement to advance technologically as rationale for increasing the extraction of natural gas and oil and potentially derailing any net zero targets. But it's not just carbon, it's water as well. These AI superclusters require vast quantities of water, and this is used for cooling. So by 2028, the US data center water usage is set to quadruple, draining over 1 billion cubic meters per year, equivalent to the household usage of 10 million Americans. And what's more, many are being built in water-scarce areas like Arizona and Nevada, creating direct competition between AI and local consumers, particularly those in the agricultural sector. So you can argue that the AI race is the new resource frontier. So aside from fossil fuel energy and water, that there will be also a race for strategic metals, rare earth minerals, and any of the components that go into semiconductor technology. Then we move on to key idea 7.7, which is all about contested spheres of influence. The study of this particular key idea emphasizes just how great it is to be studying superpowers right now. In 2026, the maps of the Arctic and the Pacific are being redrawn by superpowers as they scramble for control over both physical resources but also territory. First, the shock story of this year in early 2026. President Trump has accelerated his push to acquire Greenland from Denmark, calling it crucial for national security. He's even threatened European allies with 25% tariffs if they don't back him up on this. So why Greenland? Well, it's a resource powerhouse for starters. It contains 25 of the 34 critical raw materials for the advancements of technology, but also it would give America increasing claim over the resources in the Arctic Circle, which, as we know, contain almost a third of the world's natural gas resources. Further to this, it has cited that it would be a counter to Russia and China's increasing moves to dominate more of the Arctic territory. Russia has responded by vowing further Arctic military buildup, aligning with China to warn that ignoring their security interests in the Arctic would have far-reaching consequences. And now if we shift over to the South China Sea. In early 2026, China stepped up land reclamation in Antelope Reef, turning it into a new functional node for its navy and maritime military units. So by building these artificial islands, China is taking what would be considered de facto control over vital energy reserves and shipping routes, making it very risky for neighbours like Vietnam and the Philippines to assert their own claims on these resources. This has triggered a huge regional arms race. The Philippines, now chairing ASEAN in 2026, has turned to South Korea, a long-standing ally of the US, for both frigates and fighter jets to boost and bolster its deterrent capabilities. So this is 7.7C in action. Contested territory leading to open tension and increased military spend. And it's all to do with those contested spheres of influence. Finally, let's look at the evolving situation in Western Russia and Eastern Europe. By 2026, a 28-point US-Russia peace plan for the Ukraine has emerged, and while President Zelensky says we're about 90% there, the ceding of territory to Russia remains the crucial sticking point. Whether that will happen anytime this year, it remains to be seen. Okay, now we move on to key idea 7.8, which is all about superpowers relationships with the developing world. In 2026, we're seeing a new age of intervention. Superpowers aren't just trading with developing nations, as per that old dependency theory relationship. They are actively shaping their internal politics, and sometimes with quite explosive results. Let's look at the different ways that superpowers and emerging powers are engaging with the developing world, in which we'll also look at the Middle East. Let's look at Iran more recently in January 2026. What started as protests over a collapsing currency quickly turned into a nationwide uprising against the political regime. But here's the superpower link. President Trump's been throwing gas on the fire, and he's using his quite significant social media following to do so, repeatedly posting things like "help is on its way" and other posts and tweets and other posts that would suggest that the US is firmly behind those protesting. And he has directly threatened military strikes if the protesters are harmed in any way. By doing this, the US has given confidence to the opposing side, whilst forcing the Iranian government into a brutal and paranoid response, which has involved public hangings. What Trump's doing here is he's riding the wave of what he sees as a successful intervention in Venezuela, with the US claiming that any interventions that take place case, are on the side of instilling some kind of democratic regime which is in the best interests of the people. Essentially, as his following grows, and this was particularly bolstered by the fact that the opposition party leader of Venezuela gave him her Nobel Peace Prize medal, it effectively gives the green light for US intervention within these more local contexts, particularly where the regime is seen as oppressive. So with US claims about the restoration of democracy, critics are saying that this is just another form of colonialism. So in the case of Venezuela, the US is now ultimately going to be controlling those oil resources. Could this potentially be the start of another situation where it gains control of another territory's resources? The Middle East being well known to possess some of the largest volumes of proven reserves on the planet. And with Iran being a long-standing ally of both Russia and China, this would be a significant victory in the Middle East region. Remains to be seen what happens there. Whereas in China's playing that more long-term game of stability. So while the US destabilizes regimes, China is using its Global Development Initiative to offer an alternative to US strategies. They're the ones that are providing security without that requirement for significant political reform. So as a consequence, in 2026, nations like the United Arab Emirates are strengthening their ties with Beijing, launching new direct air routes to Chinese tech hubs and integrating Chinese credit card systems, preferring Beijing's non-interventionist approach to Washington's more direct approach. So in your mocks, you can use Venezuela 2026 as an example of hard power intervention and the Iranian protests as this idea of superpowers being able to destabilize regimes so that they can install their own political regime. So China's approach could be categorized as one that is more down the line of mediated stability. While the US pushes for collapse, China is acting as the region's economic anchor. And as far as Iran's concerned, you've got to remember that China has been a long-standing trading partner of Iran, particularly with regards to energy resources. This is in direct opposition to previously imposed US sanctions on Iran for previous nuclear proliferation programs. Furthermore, China is executing a masterclass in long-term soft power integration in Africa. So in January 2026, Beijing officially launched the China-Africa Year of People-to-People Exchanges. So this isn't just about building bridges, it's about winning the hearts and minds of the next generation. China has shifted its strategy to smaller and what could be seen as more beautiful projects, instead of things like enormous megadams, which might lead to political instability within the continent. So they're building Luban workshops, which are vocational centres that train the youth of Africa in the use of artificial intelligence, cloud computing and e-commerce. By 2026, tens of thousands of African students are studying Chinese, creating a professional class that meets Chinese tech standards. In addition to this, when considering both currency and energy, Kenya and Ethiopia are now restructuring their debt around Chinese yuan. And this is to avoid what is increasingly being seen as the volatility of the US dollar. So in summary, while the US uses strategic submission by force, China is using structural integration through both tech and trade, and thus using a more soft power approach to win the hearts and minds of the next generation. So they are more likely to ally themselves with China over the US. And then finally we move on to Key Idea 7.9, which is all about the challenges that are faced by the existing power and the degree to which they can hold on to that power status, and to what degree are we going to see transitions towards other patterns of power as we move into the future. The USA and the EU, they are still suffering from that legacy of major economic restructuring that was a consequence of the global shift that led to deindustrialization. While they remain superpowers, their structural foundations are under intense pressure. In both 2025 and 2026, the EU and the US are still struggling with immense amounts of debt. So let's get into the numbers that keep Washington awake at night. US national debt as of 2026 in January surged past $38.5 trillion. This reaching a level that economists didn't expect to see until 2030. So to put that into perspective, that's around $114,000 per person in America. So why is this a threat to superpower status? Well, it can be boiled down to the fact that this is very much an interest trap. So for the first time in history, annual interest payments on debt have exceeded $1 trillion, which means that the US is now spending more just to service its past than it spends on most of its future. Interest is now the fastest growing expense in the entire federal budget, consuming nearly 14% of all revenue. This creates a huge, what's called an opportunity cost for the superpower. Every dollar spent on interest is not a dollar spent on the AI race, the Golden Dome missile defense system, or critical infrastructure. So the defense budget for 2026 of around $1 trillion is now being matched by interest payments. And here's the invisible danger that might then start to creep in. De-dollarization. As that debt to GDP ratio starts to climb towards 120%, global investors start to get nervous. The US dollar has shed close to 10% of its value over the last year. So if the world loses that confidence in the safe haven of the dollar, it loses one of its greatest superpower privileges, the ability to borrow cheaply and sanction its enemies. Now let's compare that to the juggernaut of the East. On January the 14th, 2026, China reported an enormous 1.89 trillion trade surplus for the full year of 2025. That is more than the entire GDP of Saudi Arabia, alongside those heavy Trump tariffs. Chinese exports to the EU rose by 8.4%, and shipments to Africa surged 26%. China isn't just growing, it's successfully decoupling its wealth from the US, incorporating more and more of the global south. So in 2026, we are absolutely seeing more of a move towards that bipolar power structure, or even a multipolar one, particularly as groups, even in the European Union, such as the Alliance of the Willing, are increasingly moving away from the influence of the US. And we're increasingly creating a world where no single power can call the shots.